Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Yod. Hahu shetara dava keti be shit shenin yeterta. Sevu Rabbanan kamed Rabba lememar hay shetar meuchar hu ni akebe ad matya zimne vela tarif. There was a certain document, a loan document, and the date in it was 6 years too many. They were counting from the time of Minyan Hashtarot, from the Seleucid era, but the date was 6 years extra, 6 years later than it should be. And the rabbis looked at it and said, well, we think that we should classify this as a post-dated note. And in that case, if it's a post-dated note, then it cannot come into effect until the actual date that's on it, and the lender cannot collect from liened property in the meantime. In other words, when you have a loan document, the date on the loan document means that any land that the borrower owned from that date and on is liened to the lender. But any land that he had owned before but sold before that date, that's it. That sale comes before any lien because of the loan. And therefore, they said, well, this is 6 years too late, later than it should be, but because of that, the lender cannot collect from any land that had been sold between the correct date and the post-dated late date that's on this document. אמר רב נחמן, היי ספרה דווקא נא כתבה, והנח שיט שנין דמלכו בעלם דאנה נחשבינן להו, והוא כחשיב לה ובזמנה כתבה. Rav Nachman, who was known as being the expert judge in civil matters, monetary matters, he differed from the consensus of the other sages. And he said, no, the scribe that wrote this was exacting. And those 6 years during which the Greeks ruled in Ailam, that we, meaning the general Seleucid calendar, does not count those years. But that scribe, he counted those 6 years, and therefore this is in fact written on time. There's the widespread Seleucid calendar. That one dates from 312 BCE, because that's when the Greeks, and in particular Seleucus the first, this is Seleucus, the first king, he conquered the whole area of Syria, Asia Minor, Iran, and so on. So most people, the widespread count is from 312. However, it is possible to count from 6 years earlier when Seleucus was in charge of Ailam itself, which is Bavel. And so that would be a minority view, but it is a possible view, another calendar. And he was using that calendar. And so the extra 6 years that's in this document is using that calendar, but it actually matches up exactly with the same year in our calendar, which is that the two calendars are 6 years off from each other. And therefore, the date in the document is correct. And he should be able to, the lender should be able to collect from lien property from that real date, which in that system, which would be the same as the 6 years earlier in the common system. Tanya, Rabbi Yosef Omer, 6 shanim malchu be'elam, ve'achar kach pashta malchutan bechol ha'olam kulo. Braita, in fact, teaches that according to Rabbi Yosef, the king Seleucus reigned for 6 years in Ailam only, and only then the dominion spread throughout the entire world and became much bigger. So most people count from 312. This scribe counted from 318 BCE, and that accounts for the difference, but really, it's not a post-dated document, that's the correct date. Matkif la Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Mimai de Malchut de le Malchut Yevanim manenan, Dirma lisiat Misraim manenan, Ushbake la alfa kama, Venakte la alfa batra, Vahai meuchar hu. Then Rav Acha bar Yaakov challenges Rav Nachman and says, how do you know that the date in this document is according to the Greek Seleucid calendar? Maybe it's actually the date from the Exodus from Egypt, which is exactly 1,000 years different from 312. 312 BCE, that's the beginning of the Seleucid Empire, the majority opinion. And it so happens, if you do the math, that Yetziat Mitzrayim is precisely 1,000 years earlier, which will bring us to 1312 BCE, which is quite an interesting number because if you look at other archaeological artifacts and references in Tanakh that 1312 BCE is not a bad date to give a chronology for Yetziat Mitzrayim. Anyway, it's exactly 1,000 years off. And so perhaps the scribe left off the 1,000-year marker. Sometimes they would do that because it's obvious the 1,000 years, you know which millennium you're in, and left only the everything that's after the 1,000-year marker, and so left the hundreds and so on. And in fact, therefore, this is a post-dated document because the 1,000 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim is adding 1,000 years and counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim is the same as the taking off the 1,000 years and counting from 312 BCE. And this document had 6 years too late. And so therefore, maybe it's not, as you said, Rav Nachman, that this scribe is exacting and he's counting from the beginning of Seleucus 6 years earlier, and it's a correct date. Maybe not. Maybe, in fact, he meant to count from Yetziat Mitzrayim, and he left off the thousands, but it is 6 years off. Amar Rav Nachman, Bagola en monin ela lemalchei Yevanim belbad. And Rav Nachman says, no. When we're living in exile, we count from the Greek kings. That's the general rule. Whenever we're in exile, we use the local kings as the date in our documents, and we don't use our own dates, meaning we're not going to use from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, when he heard Rav Nachman say that, he thought Rav Nachman is just giving him a weak answer, just deflecting him to say, no, we don't do that. We count only to the local Greek kings. But then he wanted to double check Rav Acha, and he went and found a baraita that in fact says that when you're in exile, you have to count according to the Greek kings. You have to give that respect and loyalty for the local kings in the empire that you live. And you don't use our own calendar, which would be based on events in our own history, like Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so, Rav Nachman, you see how sharp he was, that he recognized, he ruled out that possibility, and therefore, the document was a correctly dated document. Amar Ravina, matnitin nami daikaditnan, bechad benisan Rosh Hashanah lemalchim velirgalim, v'amrinan lemalchim lemay hilcheta, Amar Rav Chisda lishtarot. Ravina says, I can prove that Rav Nachman is right, and what we also learned in the Braita, I can prove that that's true from a Mishnah. The fact that when you're in exile, you count according to the foreign kings of where you live. Because in the Mishnah Masechet Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning, it says that in the first of Nisan is the beginning of the year for kings and for holidays. Now, and we explained that when it says for kings, what does that mean? What does that apply to? Rav Chisda says for documents. When you're going to use dates in a document and you're going to decide what year it is, the next year should always update itself in Nisan. Utanan be'achad b'tishrei Rosh Hashanah l'shanim v'lishmitin v'amrina l'shanim l'may hilchata v'amar Chisda lishtarot kashya shtarot ahadadeh. This very same Mishnah says that another one of the heads of the year, Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishrei, that's the head of the year regarding years and for Shemitah. Shemitah we understand, right? The next Shemitah year is always updated in Tishrei. Becomes that's when Shemitah will start and end, and each of the years starts and ends. And when it says for years, what does that apply to? Rav Chisda said the same thing for documents. So now we have a contradiction. Rav Chisda said that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the date to use for documents, and over here Rav Chisda says that Tishrei is the date by which to decide when the year goes to the next year. So which one is it? And we answer, one of these is talking about the kings of Israel, and the other, the kings of the other nations. When you're counting according to the foreign kings, they update their rulership in Tishrei. But the kings of Israel, that's Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, Rosh Chodashim, so we count, update our years of kings in Nisan. Now Ravina, here's the final explanation of the proof. We nowadays update our years in Tishrei. Now, if you would think that in this document the scribe was using the dates from Yetziat Mitzrayim and just leaving out the thousands, then he should have been counting and updating every Nisan, because if it's a part of an event in our own Jewish calendar, then you should update in Nisan. But we don't do that. Nobody does that. We update the year in Tishrei. And therefore we can prove that we all follow the Greek kings. See, that's the common calendar. We follow the Seleucid calendar, and therefore Rav Achaz's proposal is not correct, but rather Rav Nachman is correct. And Rav Nachman is pointing out that there's a majority Seleucid calendar that everybody uses, but some people do follow the 6 years earlier when Seleucus first reigned over only Elam, and that calendar also, as long as you're consistent, one can use that calendar, and therefore that's what the scribe of this document was doing, and therefore it's not a post-dated document, but a correctly dated loan document. V'yom Genusya shel Malchehem ve'chuled, the Mishnah mentioned that one of the pagan holidays is the Genusya, from the same word as Genesis, of their kings. Mai v'yom Genusya shel Malchehem, what is this day of Genusya of their kings, the Roman kings? Amar Rav Yehuda yom shemamidin bo goyim et malkam. Rav Yehuda says this is the day on which they appoint their king. V'hatanya yom Genusya ve'yom shemamidin bo et malkam. But Rav Yehuda, we have a problem because there's a Baraita that says the day of Genusya and also the day on which they appoint their king. So that means Yom Genusya has to be something else besides the day that the king is appointed. La kashya hadideh hadibre. No, there's no problem. One's talking about this king himself, that's the Genusya, and the other one, that Bohet Malkam, that's talking about the son. Sometimes in dynasties, an older king would appoint his son as the next king, even during his lifetime. And so that's what it's talking about, either the coronation of himself or the coronation of his son. Umi mokme malka bar malka. Hold on. Do the Romans appoint their sons to be kings? In fact, the Roman emperors, most of them, did not appoint their biological sons to be kings. Instead, they adopted someone as a son and then made them the next emperor. And so right now we're saying, okay, you assume that it was a dynasty and it was the biological son, but the Romans don't appoint their biological sons, so they wouldn't have that. And we know that the Romans do not appoint their biological sons as the next kings, because this pasuk in Obadiah, which is referring to Edom, and we associate Edom with the Romans. And the Midrash says, "Behold, I made you small among the nations." In what way is Edom/Rome small, belittled? That their dynasties aren't strong because they don't appoint their biological sons. So this is a low life thing to do, to have to bring others and not have a physical biological dynasty. So that's one way in which they are despised, and also Midrash continues, the pasuk continues, very despised. And what way is Rome very despised? Because they don't have their own script or their own language. They borrowed their script and their language from other people that they conquered and that they were near, but don't have their own distinguished script or language. Ela ma Yom Genusya. Okay, so now we need a new answer for what is Yom Genusya. Yom Haleda. Oh, it's the birthday of the king. V'atanya Yom Genusya ve'Yom Haleda. Hold on, there's another braita that says Yom Genusya and the birthday, which means the birthday is something different. La kasha hadideh hadibre. Oh, that's no problem. One is talking about the birthday of the king himself, and the other is the birthday of his son. So that's two birthdays. V'atanya Yom Genusya shelo, v'Yom Genusya shel beno, v'Yom Haleda shelo, v'Yom Haleda shel beno. Now there's another braita that lists 4 different things. his own day of Genusia, now we still don't know what that is, the Genusia of his son, the king's birthday, and the king's son's birthday. So it can't be that Genusia has anything to do with birthday, because birthdays are covered by the other two items here. Ela mayom Genusia, yom shema'amidin bo malkam, vela kashya hadide hadibre. Rather, we're going to go back to what we said earlier, but we're going to switch out the biological son for the adopted son. And we're going to go back and say, in fact, what is Yom Genusia? That's the day that they coronate their king. And that which is said before, and the day of Genusia of himself and the day of Genusia of his son, one's talking about him, one's talking about his son. And if you're going to ask the same question that we did before, that the Romans do not appoint their biological sons to be the next king most of the time. There are some cases where they did. You can look over here where some cases where they did, but usually they didn't. But they do so al yedei she'ela mokmeh kegon asveros bar Antoninos dimlach. But they do it by borrowing, or we would say by adopting a son. So while the emperor was alive, he would adopt someone who he thought would be a good successor, and then legally made him his son, not biological, but legally his son, and then appointed them to be king, the next king, during their own lifetime. And that's what it means when it says Yom Genusia is in fact the coronation of the king, and also the next thing in the first braita and in this braita that we just saw is talking about and the coronation of the adopted son of a king. And it gives an example as Asveros bar Antoninos. There's a few options for who that is. It could be Marcus Aurelius Antoninos, the famous one, who was the Stoic philosopher, and this is probably the one that we're going to talk about now, who had conversations with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. This is probably the one that's meant, because it says he has these philosophical conversations with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Over here we're going to see some political conversations, but he also has philosophical conversations, and he's the one that writes a whole book of philosophy that's still very popular today, the book of meditation. So it's likely that this is the one that is referring to, but there are a bunch of other people that have similar or even the same names that came later, who also had adopted sons, who also were adopted sons that took over for them. Amar le Antoninos le Rabbi. And now that we mentioned Antoninos, here's a story where Antoninos, the emperor, came to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and said, Ba'inadim loch asveros beri techotai betit abed Tiberia kalanya. So this story is related to what we just said, that this Antoninos had a son, Asveros, the son of Antoninos, and he did in fact become the emperor. Asveros, the son, became emperor after Antoninos, and he was adopted. And now Antoninos, before this happened, came to the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and said, I want my adopted son, Asveros, to be the next emperor after me, and I want to appoint him now. I also have a second request from the Senate. I want Tiberia to be a colony, kalanya, literally colony. That would be a special status. Colonialism nowadays is not so good, but back then it had an official meaning that was actually good, that meant a province that gets a tax exemption. The emperor would give it to a retired general, say, here, you have this area, and the area has special status, and one of that part of being special status is a tax exemption, which is actually a very good thing for them. And I want to make the city of Tiberia in Israel a kalanya. V'ema lehu chada abdi, terela abdi. Now, for both of them, I need the approval of the Senate. But if I ask the Senate for two things, they're not going to grant it to me. If I ask them for one thing, they will grant it to me. So what should I do? Which one should I pick? I want to do both. And of course, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would certainly have interest in Tiberia becoming a tax-free city. That's in Eretz Yisrael, and he's the Nasi of Eretz Yisrael. הייתה גברה על קבי החברה ויהב ליונה לעילי בידי ואמר לתתאה אמר לעלה דמפרח מן ידי יונה אמר שמע מנך אמר לי את באמיני הוא דאסברוס ברי ימלוך תחותי ואמר לאסברוס תעבד Tiberia kalanya. And so Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he didn't give an answer directly in words, we'll see why in a minute, but rather he did a demonstration. he brought a man and he put it on the shoulders of someone else. And he took a dove and put it in the hands of the person who was on top. And he said to the one on the bottom, hey, can you please tell the person that's sitting on top of your shoulders that he should cause the dove to fly away? That was the demonstration. Antoninos was very good at charades, and he says, I know what you're saying, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. You're telling me that I should ask the Senate just one thing, that Asveros should rule instead of me. And then, once I appoint him as the ruler, I can ask Asveros that he should release Tiberia from taxes. And that's the same. The guy on the bottom, that represents he himself. The guy on the bottom represents Asveros, and Asveros will then direct the person on top to let the bird go. The release is the release from taxes that Asveros is going to do. So I guess Asveros is the guy on top. Antoninos is the one on the bottom. He will appoint someone instead of him. That's the same as putting someone on top. And then he has to all he needs from the Senate is permission to put Asveros in charge. And then once Asveros is in charge, he'll be able to do the second thing. And that way you can do both. Amale, Mesarin li chashube roma'eh. Another time, Antonino said to the Yehuda Nasi, the important people in Rome are bothering me. They keep harassing me, and I want to do something about it. But, what am I going to do? Just kill them all? There'll be a rebellion. So how do I deal with it? Me'ayeh legina, kol yoma akar le pulga, Pugla me mishra kameh. The Yehuda Nasi did not answer in words, but rather he just went to his garden, uprooted one radish, and then the next day uprooted another radish. That's all he did. He wouldn't answer the question. But Antoninos was watching all this. Amar shema minahachi ka'amar li at ketol had minayhu velat itkare behu bekulahu. I know the Yehuda Nasi is giving me advice that I should kill them one by one. Assassinate one now, assassinate one another day, and don't kill them all at once. If you go and kill all of your political enemies at once, then there'll be a whole rebellion, a big deal. But you knock off one at a time, one here, one there. Oops, he fell off the ladder. Oops, that guy got trampled by a horse. What could you do? And that way, you can get rid of them without making such a big, having such a big negative publicity. Now we ask, how come the Yehuda Nasi did not tell him these answers explicitly? Why not use words? Amar shema bi chashube romi u'mesa'aru li. Because the Yehuda Nasi says, I know the important people in Rome might hear that I gave the advice, and then they'll come after me and bother me. So I don't want that. I don't want any trouble. So if I give them advice, here's how to get around the Senate. Ask them for this thing, and then the next emperor, he'll do the other thing, and they'll see that I'm giving the emperor loopholes. Or the second one's even much more dangerous. If I tell them, oh, you should pick them off one by one, and people hear that I gave that advice, then they'll come after me. So he doesn't want to get involved like that, but he does want to give advice. Therefore he hints at it. Now, why not whisper it? Just say it in a whisper. Say it in his ear. Why do you have to do a demonstration like this? Because the pasuk that says, a bird of the air shall carry the voice. Now, there's rumors spread. Somehow, even if you think there's nobody around, someone will hear it. Someone will see, they were talking, and then the next day this happened, and they'll figure something out. And therefore, better not even to say anything at all. Instead, he just does a demonstration. People come and say, hey, did you tell the emperor to do this? He says, what do you mean? I just picked a radish. So what? I picked a radish today. I picked a radish tomorrow. I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything. And that way, he won't be blamed for what the emperor does. And now another story about Antoninos and Rabbi. Havaleahu berata dishma Gira. Antoninos had a daughter. Her name was Gira. Kavda Isura, and she acted promiscuously. And so Antoninos needed advice about what to do with her. Shadad le Gargira. And they continued to communicate in code language. And so Antoninos sent a rocket plant, which the name of it, Gad Gira. Gad means committed adultery, and Gira is her name. So it means my daughter, Gira, she acted promiscuously. Shadar le Kusbarta. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sent her a coriander, which is a combination of kos, mean kill, barta, daughter. Yes, so it would be said, you should kill her because she committed adultery. Sheda le karti, but Antonino sent back leaks, and karti means if I do that, they'll cut me off. I'll be excommunicated, ashamed. That people will say that the emperor killed his own daughter. Shalach le chasa, so Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sent a lettuce, chasa, which means to have mercy. In other words, have mercy on her and don't do anything to her. Kol yom ahava shedar le dahava pericha b'matrata v'chite apumayhu. Now another story. Every day Antoninos would send to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi crushed gold, or little pieces of gold, in a large sack, and they put wheat at the opening of the sack. So it looked like it was a sack of wheat, but really it was gold. And he told his servants, take this wheat to Rabbi. Rabbi opened it up, saw there's gold in it, and he sent back a message. He says, I don't need it, I have a lot. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was very wealthy. He said, I know you don't need it, but give it to those who come after you, who will give it to their descendants, who will give it to their descendants, and they can use from that to bring the gold to the Roman Empire to pay taxes. In other words, right now we're on good relations, and that should last a long time, but eventually there will come a generation where the Jews will not be so favorably inclined by the emperor, and they will have to pay taxes. So keep this in reserves for the time when you will have to pay the Roman government, your descendants. Hava lehahi nekarta dehava al ayla mi bete lebet Rabbi. Kol yoma hava maiti tere abde chad ketale ababa de berbi vechad ketale ababa de bete. Another story that there was an underground tunnel that connected the house of Antoninos with the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And every day Antoninos would go and visit Rabbi, but he didn't want anybody to know that he was visiting Rabbi, and he would go and ask him advice and serve him, as we're going to see in a minute. And so he would go, and he had 2 servants with him, because he's the emperor, so he needs 2 servants to carry his stuff and to help him along the way, carry the candle through the tunnel. But the servants, he was afraid that the servants would go and report to others that he had this secret tunnel and he's going to visit Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So he would kill one of his servants at the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he kept one alive to get back to his palace, and then he would kill that one once he got back to his palace, and then that way there were no witnesses. And the emperor also told Rabbi, at the time that I come to visit you, do not have anybody else there. I don't want anybody else to know. I don't want you to have anybody else in your house. It should be totally private. One time Antoninos came to visit Rabbi, and he found that Rabbi Chanina bar Chama was there. He was also in Rabbi's house. And so the emperor says, didn't I tell you when I come visit, there should not be found any person among you? Rabbi says that this is not a human being. He is so holy, he's like an angel. Don't worry about him, he's safe. So the emperor now was going to test out Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, and he tells Rabbi Chanina, listen, go out, tell the servant, he's sleeping outside at the entrance of the house of Rabbi, go tell him to come over here. Now this is a trick, because in fact this slave was dead, right? We just mentioned that he kills one slave at the entrance to Rabbi's house. He wasn't sleeping, he was dead. Azal Rabbi Chanina bar Chama shkechet avaketil. So Rabbi Chanina goes and he finds that the servant has died, was killed. Amar hechi abid. Now he's thinking to himself, what am I going to do now? If I go back and tell Antoninos the emperor that his servant is dead, that's not a good idea, because it's not a good idea to report bad news to the emperor. He's going to take it out on the messenger. Can't report bad news. If I just leave and go away, well then that will be acting disrespectfully towards the king. King asked me to do something, I have to fulfill it and come back. So Rabbi Hanina prayed and brought the servant back to life and brought him to the emperor. Amar yadana zute deit bechu mechayemeti mihu beidana deatena la nishkach inish kamach. Anyway, that was all a test to see what Rabbi Hanina would do, and evidently he passed the test. And so Antonino said, now I see that even the least among you has the power to revive the dead. Even this guest that you have in your house, Rabbi, can revive the dead. Nevertheless, even though you're right, he's angelic and we could trust him, still, please, I don't want anybody to be in your house when I come visit you. I don't want to take any risks at all. Every day when Antoninus would come to the bee's house, Antoninus would feed the bee and give and pour wine for the bee and serve him. Amazing. Ki hava ba'ay the bee mesak lepuria hava gachin kame puria amar lesak ilavai lepuriach. And when the bee wanted to go into his bed, they had very high beds. He had to climb up all the way into. And so when the bee wanted to go up to his bed, Antoninus would bend down and say, here, climb on my back so you can get into your bed. This is something usually a servant would do. You see, the rabbis are telling the story to say, even though in public it looks like, the Romans are ascendant and the Jews are downtrodden, and the Romans are telling the Jews, see, look how God has abandoned you and so on, and it's really difficult to live like that for a long time under such not only physical but psychological subjugation. But stories like this would say, listen, in private and secret, if you ask the emperor, he really has great respect for the Jews and for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the patriarch, who represents the Jewish people in Judea. So imagine that he's climbing on the back of the emperor. But Abi says it's not proper for me to disrespect the king to that extent. It's one thing for you to go make me lunch and bring it to me, but another thing to step on your back. I don't want to do that. I don't feel comfortable. And the emperor says, if only I could be just a mattress under you in the world to come. I recognize that you, the Jewish people, are going to have world to come, and I'm doing this so that maybe I can have some favor when we get there. Antoninus asked, am I worthy to come to the world to come? And the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, yes. And the emperor apparently knows Pesukim pretty well. And he quotes the Pasuk in Obadiah. It says, there will not be any remaining of the house of Esav. House of Esav, a reference to the Romans. So there's not going to be anybody left, no survivors, nobody to live to the world to come. But Rabbi said, no, that's only those who act like Esav. And so it's not about a race. Even if someone is a descendant of Esav or a part of the Romans, but they don't act that way, they act in a good way, then they are deserving of reward. Tanyana mehachi lo yeb sarid lebet Esav yachol lakol tamudomad lebet Esav be'oseh ma'aseh Esav. There's a braita that supports what Rabbi answered. Quoting the same pasuk that there will not be a remnant for Esav. Does it mean there won't be any remnant at all for anyone from Esav? No, it means lebet Esav. If they act like Esav, then they will have no continuity. But if they act properly, then they will have reward. Antoninus quotes another pasuk from Yechezkel talking about in the netherworld and the place where people get punished. It says there is Edom and her kings and her leaders. So you see, we're all in Gehinnom getting punished. But the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi answers, it says, look, notice it says melacheha means some of her kings, but not all of her kings. Some of the Roman kings will be okay. And it says kol nesiyah, true, all of the leaders, but doesn't say all of the officers. So there will be some Roman officers that will be worthy, and we're going to see an example of one. Tanyana mehachi melacheha v'lo kol melacheha kol nesiyah v'lo kol sareha. Melacha v'lo kol melacha pirat Antoninus ben Asveros. But Braita supports the same thing. It says her kings, but not all of her kings, and her leaders, but not all of her officers. Who is that referring to? And it says kings, but not all of her kings. So most of the kings of Edom will go to the netherworld, but the exception will be Antoninus ben Asveros. He was worthy to the world to come. And when it says all of her leaders, but not all the officers, there is an officer named Kitiyah bar Shalom who is worthy of the world to come. Kitiyah bar Shalom, this could be the Roman senator Flavius Clemens. Clemens means mercy, or so that meant the shalom might be a translation of that. And he is reported to be a good guy and to have converted and was persecuted by the emperor because of that. So this might be the same story that's mentioned about that guy. So what happened with him? Kitial bar Shalom Hayaveh. What's his story? Tahu kesara tavas saneli hudae. There was a Roman emperor who hated the Jews. Amar lehu lechashibed malchuta mi she'ala lo nima beraglo yikta'ena v'yichye o yenichena v'yista'er amiru lo yikta'ena v'yichye. He told the important people in the kingdom, if a person has an infection on his leg, should he cut off his leg and live, or should he let the infection spread and then he'll suffer? And they said, well, you should cut it off. What are you going to do? You have to lose a limb in order to save a life. And that's the mashal. The nimshal is that the Jewish people are like this ulcerous cancer infection, and they are part of the Roman Empire and going to infect the whole thing. So what should we do? And so their answer is destroy all the Jewish people, and then we'll get rid of this disease from them. It's amazing. This sounds familiar. Exactly what the Nazis were saying. Amar lehu Kitiah bar Shalom hadad la yachal lehu lekulahu. But Kitiah bar Shalom, he was one of the leaders, the officers there, and he objected and he said, listen, it's not a good idea. Number one, you can't kill all of them because the Jews are all over the place. They're scattered. Hashem said, the pasuk in Zechariah says, I have spread you abroad like the four winds of heaven. And so you're not going to be able to kill all of them. Even the Nazis, as efficient as they were, they couldn't reach every country and every continent. Maika Amar, Ilema dar tehon baruchot, hai kar baruchot, lea baruchot mi ba'eleh. Now, what does pasuk mean? Is it saying that Hashem has scattered the Jewish people to the four winds, directions of the world? But why does it say ke'arba? Should it said to the four directions of the world? But it says like the four directions of the world. So, or like literally like the four winds. So it doesn't mean only that the Jewish people are scattered. Rather, what the pasuk means is just like you cannot have, the world cannot exist without wind. You need wind to move the clouds and bring rain and all kinds of things that the wind does. And so just like the world cannot exist without wind, so too the world cannot exist spiritually without Israel. So, if you kill the Jewish people, you're going to end up destroying the world. And spiritually, morally, you're not going to have the Jewish people around. It's going to be your own downfall, which is also true. Every kingdom and empire that kicked out the Jews from its midst ended up falling. And furthermore, if you kill all the Jews, then people will say the Roman kingdom is a murderous kingdom. And so don't you want to be known as a righteous kingdom? Why? What will people say about you? Be the severed kingdom. So this is not a good idea. That's what Kitiah bar Shalom. So you see, he's a good guy. He stood up and risked his life to speak well of the Jewish people and save them from destruction. So the emperor says, you say a good point. You have a good argument. There's only one problem, the emperor says. Anyone who bests the king in an argument, we throw him into the oven full of ashes. So when you're talking to the emperor, you're really damned if you do and if you don't. If you lose, say a bad argument, he's going to kill you. You can't give bad news to the king. And if you even say a good argument that he's convinced by, he says, oh, good point. Okay, now you have to die because you beat me in an argument. And so they took Kitiah and were taking him to his death. And a certain matronita, an important Roman woman, said, woe to the ship that goes without paying tax. You have to pay tax. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to dock in the place that you're going to. And this is a mashal. The nimshal is that you haven't converted. You did all these great things, but you will get more reward if you convert. So look, you're going on your way on this journey to Olam Haba, but you should pay the tax. The tax is the Brit Milah that he doesn't have. So he heard that. Nefal al resha de'orlate keta'ah. So he fell over onto his Brit Milah and he cut it off. It sounds like he did the Brit Milah with his own teeth. Amar yehabit michsi chalafit va'avarit. He says, okay, now I gave my tax, now I will be able to pass and enter into Olam Haba. Ki shadu le amar kol nichsai leRabbi Akiva v'chaverav. Once they were about to kill him, and once they threw him into the oven, this place of ashes, he announced and he said, all of my property I want to bequeath to Rabbi Akiva and to his colleagues. Yasa Rabbi Akiva v'darash v'yel laron u'banav mechsa laron u'mechsa now, this general Kiti'ah did not say how much goes to Rabbi Akiva and how much goes to his other colleagues. So Rabbi Akiva quoted the pasuk that says it will be for Aaron and his sons, and over there it means that half goes to Aaron and half goes to his sons. So too, a half should go to Rabbi Akiva and then half to everybody else. And a voice came out and said, a divine voice announced that Kitiyah Bar Shalom is invited to the world to come. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi cried and said, look how some people can acquire their world to come just in one moment. He was an evil Roman officer his whole life, but he made one decision at the end of his life, and look how he gained Olam Haba. Other people have to work for their whole lives, years and years of toil in order to achieve Olam Haba. Antonina Shammeshe Lerabi. Adarkan Shammeshe Lerav. Just like Antoninos served Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in Israel, so too the Persian king Adrakan served Rav. Same deal. Ki shechib Antoninos amar Rabbi nitpareda chavila. When Antoninos died, he predeceased Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said the bundle is separated, meaning our bond, our alliance, the close relationship that we had is now separated. Who knows what's going to happen next? Ki shechib Adarkan amarav nitpareda chavila. And similarly, when Adarkan, the Persian king, died, Rav, who lived in Persia and had a close relationship with him, said the bundle has been separated. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.